when they now currently have them. And so right here, we have a signed copy of the invitation to Senator Fred Harris out of Oklahoma, signed by the Prince of the Netherlands. He, of course, is the founder of Bilderberg. He was inspired to create the group by this man right here, Dr. Joseph Redinger. He was a Jesuit. He was a advocate of the secret steering groups. Now, Bilderberg itself, you have to understand, came out of the Cecil Rhodes Roundtable model. Cecil Rhodes was one of these great robber barons. He basically conquered much of Africa. He created a false flag through the newspapers he owned in what used to be 4 territories in South Africa. He created the Boer War. He stirred it up himself personally using his top, very influential friends. They created conflict that led to Boer Wars #1 and #2, and the state we now know as South Africa. He was hailed as a hero by the Queen, given all kinds of awards and designations, but more importantly, he worked with Victor Rothschild and other members, of the Rothschild family to set up these secret steering groups, the Cecil Rhodes Roundtables. This became, in the United States, the Council on Foreign Relations. This became, in the UK, the Royal Institute on International Affairs. The other Western countries had their counterparts as well. Now, today, we see Russia having a Russian Institute on International Affairs. China now has a branch, and they steer so much a policy by meeting partially in public, partially in secret, with the most influential people in the world to dictate policy. Yes, Bilderberg does dictate policy. These documents support that claim. So does all of our research and history. Anyway, I'll read from the letter. It is short. It comes out of The Hague. The address for Prince of the Netherlands, that is Prince Bernhard. Today, his daughter, Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands, continues his legacy at Bilderberg. He sent it out in December 1965. I have the honor to invite you to the next Bilderberg meeting, which will be held at the Hotel Nasserhof at Wiesbaden, Germany, 25, 26, 27 March 1966. Then on page 2, he lists the agenda. It's quite short, but extremely important. Should NATO be reorganized, and if how? And point number 2, the future of world economic relations, especially between industrial and developing countries. We'll get to that in just a moment, but first I'll show you a few exhibits. Among these are the letters inviting Senator Harris, explaining the travel arrangements, and more. They come from the head of the U.S. branch of Bilderberg. It was Joseph E. Johnson in the 60s. Notice the letterhead, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a very important body. All these robber barons of the early 20th century were hated by the public for monopolizing industry and for lording it over the people. Their Pinkerton forces, in the case of the Rockefellers, killed people for going on strike, etc. But they learned how to use the growing PR mechanisms that Edward Bernays, Ivy Lee, and other experts set up to fool people into think they were helping you, because they named their organizations things like Peace, International Peace, Carnegie Endowment. And so a very important arm of Bilderberg today, Jessica T. Matthews heads the Carnegie Endowment, so that trend continues. Anyway, he's inviting the American members to the meeting, telling them what to expect, and really telling them also who they can trust and talk to within the Senate. You will see in different letters here, and that's part of the larger trend of how our Congress was infiltrated, how they took over the country from within. It's not the outside enemy, it's the inside nefarious scheming. Particularly all these foundations, which were later investigated in the 50s, they tried to have those documents destroyed. People like Iserby did not let that happen. Thankfully, we have many of those documents now. Anyway, those are on file. Notice they come from Carnegie, First National, Citibank, all basically robber baron entities. I believe First National was connected to Rockefeller. If not, certainly someone important. I will set those aside. And we have hundreds of documents. You'll have to forgive me for trying to organize these on the air because there's so many. But, of course, we have here a lot of the handwritten notes from Senator Fred Harris inside the 1966 Bilderberg Conference. He's got headers here for each of the countries as they spoke and the different speakers. He's got names, of course, for the American delegates. In the case of many of the European delegates that he probably didn't know personally, he has either their country or how they were secretary or what have you for different entities. And handwriting is not always the easiest to read, but it's very important. You see recurrent themes about NATO, which again, Fred Harris was studying, the military integration, how it's necessary. That's from a UK delegate. The organizational aspects, and on about how nationalism is what's bad, how nationalism is contagious, how nationalism is part of this pre-1914 mentality. Right here, we have John J. McCloy. He happens to be a very important figure. He was a member of Skull and Bones, and he had a number of very high up posts. He was inside, of course, our governments. He was considered one of the wise men under JFK and Johnson and other presidents. He had positions including Assistant Secretary of War during World War II, but he was simultaneously a lawyer for I.G. Farben. He was responsible for policy for things like, should we bomb the trains that go to Auschwitz, which we now know were concentration camps? Well, ultimately, that didn't happen, and you have to ask yourself why. Was it because he was connected on the inside to I.G. Farben, where, I might add, Prince Bernhard, the founder of Bilderberg, was the head of I.G. Farben on the board? Well, it really speaks for itself, because all these Skull and Bones members were caught funding the Nazi mechanism, not because they believed Hitler would conquer Europe, but because they wanted to integrate Europe by creating a boogeyman. At least that's what I believe after having studied it. When they got caught, they didn't really get caught because they had a mechanism in the Netherlands, where Prince Bernhard is from, in which they could quickly transfer assets from the Nazi mechanism back to the Anglosphere, the Atlantic sphere, based in the UK and the United States, and they indeed did that. Now, John J. McCloy was head of the World Bank. He was chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, which is the Rockefeller organ. He was chairman of the Ford Foundation, chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a member of the Warren Commission, so you could see some of his tentacles there. Anyway, in these handwritten notes from Senator Fred Harris, you see things about how de Gaulle and his nationalism could spread, how it's troubling, how nationalism stimulates nationalism, how this pre-1914 mentality is dangerous. He says, when you stress independence, flexibility, and nationalism, you're really going back to the pre-1914 mishmash. That, again, is a quote from Senator Fred Harris's handwritten notes while listening to the speeches at Bilderberg, in this case from John J. McCloy, in other cases from the other senators, from the other delegates, from the other people from this world government system they've been pursuing now for more than a century, how de Gaulle... And it's just repeated talk about de Gaulle, how the surging nationalism in France could spread to Germany, Western Germany, of course, at the time, and on, and how we urgently need NATO to be built up. That was the key, again, as I pointed out, on the agenda in the 1966 meeting. Here's some of the handwritten notes from the Austrian delegate, and they're all on the list right over here, I might add. One second while I find that list. At any rate, it goes on. Now, one of the most important delegates at this meeting was the United Auto Workers president. His name was Reuter. And his notes are coming up. And the point is that all the most important people inside U.S. foreign policy, which had become very hegemonic after World War II, were part of either secret societies or connected to these world government pursuing foundations that connect to the robber barons. And that is really how we were taken over from within. I think the last two presidents in this country were clearly Eisenhower and JFK. They both had their own baggage. They were not perfect people by any means, but I think by the end, they had both begun to figure out that we were not really working for America, but a foreign offshore interest, as Alex often terms it. Now, right here, we have Walter P. Reuther. He is the head of United Auto Workers. And again, here are Senator Fred Harris's notes from within that meeting. He says, quote, NATO is in trouble because common fears are reduced. And he says nationalism is dangerous. Nationalism is dangerous. Is underlined. Nationalism is the problem. We must pursue peace, world government, building community, regionalism, some of the others say in these notes. And it goes on and on. Of course, it's going to take some time to break down the handwritten notes. We're going to break, but we're going to be back still in overdrive with this special presentation of the leaked Bilderberg documents. They are from 1966. They come directly out of the meeting. Again, they include handwritten notes, memorandums, invitations, travel plans, and on the other side of this break, we're going to get into the policy papers that they presented at Bilderberg, who those speakers were, what they represent, and how it ties in to the policy that was openly.
The longevity products work for many others.
We are back at Infowars.com and Prisonplanet.tv. I'm Aaron Dykes. I've been traveling with Alex to the Bilderberg 2012 summit. It's not just dogs and cats living together. It's socialist and so-called capitalists working behind the scenes to steer the world agenda. We're deep inside the leaked Bilderberg documents out of the 1966 conference from the Bilderberg meetings in Wiesbaden, Germany, and they are bombshell. We have, of course, the list. It's not only the founder, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, who later had to step down because of his bribery scandals. It's people from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's David Rockefeller of the Chase Manhattan Bank and the World Empire. It's half a dozen or more of his emissaries and appointees at Standard Oil, at the other entities they control. It's important Europeans like Giovanni Agnelli of the Fiat Company, who helped build the European Union through the steel and coal community that they built and intended to grow. It's people like Marcus Wallenberg out of Sweden. Now today, his son Jacob Wallenberg still attends and still steers their agenda. On the U.S. side, we have a lot of important people, particularly out of the NATO sphere. Most of them are skull and bones or connected directly to it. Among them are the writers of that year's policy paper, Robert R. Bowie. Should NATO be reorganized, and if so, how? March 1966. And in this policy paper, Robert R. Bowie, who is a member of the CFR, who's a member of the Trilateral Commission, who attended these Bilderberg meetings, and is a John J. McCloy acolyte, who we talked about on the other segment, wrote about how NATO should be built up, how the Atlantic Alliance should be fostered. Atlantic Alliance, of course, between the United States and the European sphere, how that should not only be a military counter threat to the Soviets, but that even if there weren't a Soviet threat, they should still use it to integrate Europe as they began under the Marshall Plan, the Schuman Plan, and much more. That's a 20-page policy paper, and it's just bombshell. Meanwhile, at the same meeting, they met on the development of finance in the international and developed world and discussed how it would continue to be steered. They use these agreements to bind the developing countries so they can suck out their resources for corporate gain and control the populations quite literally through food supply, through conditionalities that dictate the way the countries will develop. They do not have independence. They think national sovereignty is pure poison and that only world government is the future. Here's the other policy paper from the 1966 meeting, The Future of World Economic Relations, especially between industrial and developing countries, by J. Ten Bergen. That is a professor who undoubtedly works directly for Prince Bernhard in 1966 out of Rotterdam, summarizing how entities including USAID, the Agency for International Development, the World Bank, the United Nations, and many others will control and dictate exports from the industrialized world and will figure out how to balance the growing world population by using food as a weapon. That later came out some 6, 7, 8 years later under Henry Kissinger and National State Memorandum number 200, where he literally said food as a weapon. Just disgusting stuff. And we've got other key members. The top delegates on the U.S. side were, of course, Joseph E. Johnson of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's in these documents inviting people like Senator Fred Harris, whose library these documents were leaked out of. There's also George W. Ball. He was Secretary of State under JFK, continued to be a key advisor under Johnson after JFK's death, and he is connected to and advising them. You can see in this document how, quote, in the past, it's been our custom to have Undersecretary of State George W. Ball advising the American delegation. It goes on. Ball is one of the architects of the Vietnam War. He told JFK in 5 years, we'll have 300,000 troops in Vietnam. JFK told him he was crazy and it would never happen. Basically, over my dead body. And I think you can connect the dots from there. There's other important stuff, but you see here how the NATO document written by the Skull and Bones related acolytes, should NATO be reorganized, was echoed in the Atlantic Community Quarterly, the NATO Journal, how it was echoed in Senate hearings, the Atlantic Alliance Treaty and related, and how their fellow wise men buddies like Dean Acheson gave hearings and testimonies based directly on what was written about, discussed, and decided inside the Bilderberg meetings. That's all we're going to bring you for today. We'll give you even more detail from these bombshell leaking documents coming up. We'll go back now to Alex's live coverage from the road. Bilderberg 2012, our return trip. Debrief